Okay, well, first, let me apologize for not being able to attend the European Organic Congress myself. I am, however, very delighted to have this opportunity to have a short exchange of views with you about the issues raised at this Congress. Must food production intensify to export to developing countries? It's actually a very difficult question, because what we've seen in the past 20 years is that many poor countries have been increasingly dependent on international markets to feed themselves. They basically did not invest enough in agriculture to feed their own populations. They only invested in certain export commodities that were necessary for them to have access to foreign currencies. And as a result, these countries were more and more dependent on imports to feed themselves. The average least developed country imports about 20% of the food that it consumes. And so these countries have developed a sort of addiction to cheap food, which means that they now must move towards something different, which is more self-sufficiency, which is less dependency on international markets, with all the risks that this implies. And the EU, in the reform of its common agricultural policy, must accompany this transition, accompany this shift, which means that we must be very attentive in reforming the way European agriculture develops to the impacts on developing countries. We must make sure that these countries are not victims of dumping on their local markets, which in the past has had very detrimental consequences for their local producers. And at the same time, we must gradually ensure that these countries are allowed to rebuild their agriculture and to be less dependent on the import of cheap food from international markets, which again, they have, which puts them in a very non-sustainable solution. So I insist that in the common agricultural policy reform, we take this dimension into account, and that the monitoring of the impacts of our policies on developing countries is improved in the next few years. Well, we have to acknowledge that much progress has been done in this area. The export subsidies, the export rebates that in the past were extremely detrimental to developing countries have been, to a large extent, phased out. They now represent some 3% of the budget of the Common Agricultural Policy, although they have been re-established in 2009 for dairy products and pork, for example, and the commitment made by the EU and others to phase out entirely these export subsidies by 2013, a commitment made in 2005 at the Hong Kong Ministerial Conference of the WTO, is one that depends on a global trade deal, which is probably not going to be achieved. So we've made some progress on that front. At the same time, we must acknowledge that much of the impacts on developing countries' markets of us dumping our agricultural products on these markets is the result of subsidies that are not limited to export subsidies, direct payments to producers, support to producers for the storage of cereals, for example, which explains that we export food on developing countries' markets at a price that is not necessarily covering even the costs of production. This is a problem, and we must, of course, support our agricultural producers, but we must do so in ways that do not have negative impacts on developing countries' markets. And so we have to monitor these impacts very carefully. And I think this can be managed by adequate tools that can monitor these impacts. Well, we are now in a situation in which we realize that our food systems are totally unsustainable from the environmental point of view. The unsustainability stems from the fact that agriculture contributes significantly to climate change. 14% of the greenhouse gas emissions come from the way food is produced, particularly in industrialized countries. And if we add to this deforestation for the creation of pastures or the expansion of cultivated areas, we arrive at the conclusion that some 33% of greenhouse gas emissions come from agriculture. In our countries, in developed countries, much of the greenhouse gas emissions and the energy used in the food systems come from the transport, the processing, the packaging of food outside the field itself, if you wish. And so the environmental impacts are very important. Secondly, the dependence on fossil fuels is extremely important. We are completely dependent on gas and oil to produce the food with which we feed ourselves. And our food chains really begin in the gas fields in Russia and in the oil fields of the Middle East as a result. And this is the result of the industrialization of agriculture since essentially the 1940s and the massive use of nitrogen-based fertilizers in the fields, which allow us to produce food while at the same time destroying the soils on which food is being produced. So we need to shift to something different, and this has to be planned. We have to gradually become less addicted to fossil fuels and to external inputs that are now inputs on which agriculture depends. And we can do this, but it will require investment, it will require training, it will require research. Where must we invest? We must invest in research that essentially allows farmers to understand how to better use nature in order to produce food in ways that are more sustainable and that combine the plants with trees and with animals, and that recycle more biomass into the soils than is done currently. Currently what happens? Agricultural producers depend on external inputs which they have to buy. They put this on the field and they use this in production, and then they sell one output for the markets. The rest is waste which they have to get rid of. Instead, we can develop types of food production that are much more cyclical and that mimic nature on the field rather than the industrial processes which are linear and which use inputs to produce outputs. This cyclical approach to agriculture is what I call agroecology, and it is a way, if you wish, to use the elements of nature in order to produce food by mimicking the complementarities between plants, trees and animals. This requires investment because it means that for the knowledge about these sound farming practices to develop and to be scaled up, farmers have to be taught how to farm sustainably. They must be supported by market conditions that make this economically sustainable, and they must be able to be competitive on the markets, which runs against the huge subsidization of the uses of fossil energies in agriculture today. So the report was essentially prepared because we are now witnessing in some developing countries, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, a massive reinvestment in agriculture. And the question behind the report was, what lessons can we learn from the past attempts to boost productivity in agriculture? And what should now be the priorities for countries making these reinvestments? Attempting a new green revolution in sub-Saharan Africa in agriculture as it's often described. And the report essentially says the following. It says, we can increase productivity, and we must increase productivity because of expansion of demand. But we can do this without repeating the mistakes of the past, without depleting the soils, without polluting the groundwaters, without developing an increased dependency on fossil energy in order to produce food. And the report, in this spirit, examines a range of farming techniques that are much more efficient in the use of natural resources, that allow to economize on pesticides and on chemical fertilizers, and that nevertheless can very significantly intensify production and increase productivity per hectare. This requires, as I said, training of farmers. This requires that knowledge that is developed about these sound farming techniques is better shared across farmers by horizontal exchange of knowledge. Farmer field schools, for example, are very important in this respect. But if farmers are taught to do this, it makes farming much more affordable for them because they are not obliged to buy external inputs and to have access to credit as a result. They can basically produce inputs locally and they can recycle whatever they produce, which otherwise would be considered waste. They could recycle this in order to nourish the soils with the nutrients that are provided by, for example, the dejection of animals or the leaves of trees and the biomass that is produced from agriculture. Now, there's a wide variety of techniques that my report looks at which correspond to this emerging paradigm of sustainable agriculture. It's primarily meant to serve the developing countries which are now making important choices. And I advocate biological control, I advocate agroforestry, I show studies demonstrating that the increasing yields can be extremely important by using these techniques. But I also think the report is useful to us in developed economies, in industrialized countries, because in 15, 20 years, we will be facing a massive ecological crisis. We will be facing peak oil and peak gas, which means that we will have to change our ways of producing food. And I advocate to plan for this transition because it cannot be done at once and it should not be the result of a crisis. It should be the result of a gradual change in the way we produce food today.